Joe Fusco was never the loudest dancer on American Bandstand, but he didn't have to be. With dark hair neatly combed, a sharp suit, and a smile that seemed to welcome the music itself, he became one of the show's most recognizable regulars. On screen, Joe projected calm confidence, the kind that made his steps look effortless and his presence unforgettable. Born and raised in South Philadelphia, he was just a teenager when he stepped onto the floor at Studio B. Within moments, viewers across the nation were watching him glide to the rhythm of rock and roll. To his neighbors back home, it was astonishing. The boy from the corner barbershop was suddenly a television figure. Yet Joe's story didn't end with the music that first lifted him into the spotlight. He would later become the quiet heartbeat of the Bandstand family, remembered as much for his loyalty as for his dance. Joe Fusco's life began in South Philadelphia, in a household that reflected the traditions of Italian-American families who had built their lives there after the war. His parents, William and Francis Fusco, worked hard to keep their children, Rosemary, Peter, Josephine, and Joe, rooted in family values. Their row house was modest, but it was filled with warmth, laughter, and the smell of home-cooked meals. Sundays meant family gatherings and church, the rituals that gave Joe a sense of belonging before he ever set foot on a dance floor. The neighborhood itself shaped him just as much as family. South Philly was alive with music pouring out of radios and jukeboxes, kids racing down sidewalks, and teenagers experimenting with the newest fashions. By the early 1950s, America was shifting. Teenagers were beginning to define themselves as a cultural force, with rock and roll as their anthem. Joe, full of energy and always in motion, fit perfectly into this new rhythm. At school, he was known for his friendliness rather than his academics. He loved being around people, joining in games, joking with friends, and, above all, dancing. Local record hops and church socials became his playground. He wore out more than one pair of shoes, practicing the jitterbug and the stroll, steps that would soon become his calling card. At home, the family's radio served as his private stage, filling the living room with rhythm and blues, while Joe moved across the floor with infectious enthusiasm. Though his parents may not have fully understood the pull of this new music, they recognized Joe's passion. They gave him the space to follow it, trusting that he would still carry their values of loyalty, respect, and family. That support proved critical because it allowed Joe to take risks that would soon lead him into Studio B. In those ordinary years, filled with family dinners, neighborhood dances, and the steady beat of rock and roll, the foundation of Joe's character was set. He was a boy with restless energy, an easy smile, and a hunger for rhythm. What he couldn't know was that these small beginnings were about to collide with something extraordinary, the chance to dance on national television. For Joe Fusco, the leap from neighborhood dance halls to national television happened almost by chance. In the late 1950s, American Bandstand had already become the talk of South Philadelphia. Teenagers lined up outside Studio B, hoping to get past the door and onto the dance floor that America was watching every afternoon. Joe, still in his teens, joined those lines one day, his polished look and calm energy making him stand out even before he took a single step. The first impression of Studio B was unforgettable. Bright lights washed over a floor crowded with eager teens, while the throb of rock and roll pulsed through the air. Dick Clark's steady voice guided the broadcast, and the giant cameras loomed like silent guards of a new world. For Joe, walking into that environment was a shock and a thrill. Suddenly, the music that had filled his living room was alive on a stage that reached across the nation. When his moment came to dance, Joe didn't hesitate. Years of neighborhood practice had given him the confidence to let the rhythm take over. His steps were smooth, controlled, and stylish, not flashy, but authentic. The producers noticed, and soon he was invited back, joining the ranks of the regulars who gave the show its distinctive energy. At home, the reaction was immediate. Neighbors gathered around televisions to point out the familiar face they had seen on the street the week before. For his family, pride mixed with astonishment, Joe wasn't just their son or brother anymore. He was a figure teens from coast to coast were beginning to recognize. That first appearance marked the turning point. From then on, Joe Fusco wasn't just a boy from South Philly. He was part of a cultural wave that defined an era, a regular whose style and presence would become etched into the memory of millions. And as the weeks rolled on, it became clear that Joe was not going to fade into the background. He was stepping firmly into the spotlight. Once Joe Fusco became a familiar face on American Bandstand, his presence resonated beyond the dance floor. He was not the flashiest performer, but his elegance and steady rhythm gave him a kind of quiet magnetism. Viewers noticed the way he carried himself, with confidence, with poise, and with a smile that suggested he was enjoying every note of the music. In a sea of energetic teenagers, Joe managed to be distinctive simply by being himself. The fan response confirmed his impact. Letters addressed to Joe Fusco of Bandstand arrived at the studio, and he found his name mentioned alongside other popular regulars in teen magazines. His clean-cut Italian-American style, dark hair combed neatly, polished shoes, sharp clothes, became part of the visual iconography of the show. For many teens watching at home, Joe's look was as much a part of the program's allure as the music itself. On screen, Joe's greatest strength was his chemistry with dance partners. Whether moving with Janet Hamill, Justine Corelli, or Myrna Horowitz, he made each pairing look effortless. There was an ease in the way he connected, not only with his partners, but with the invisible audience watching through television screens. Fans remarked on how genuine his smile felt, how his movements looked like an invitation rather than a performance. The nation was changing, and television was becoming the stage for teenage culture. Joe, without ever seeking stardom, found himself swept into that current. His appearances weren't limited to the broadcast alone. He was recognized on the street, greeted by peers as though he had stepped out of the TV and into everyday life. In a decade when teenagers craved idols who reflected their own experiences, Joe Fusco was exactly that. Familiar, approachable, yet still touched by the glamour of television fame. But with every spotlight comes expectation. To be one of the regulars meant always presenting yourself with polish and grace, always living up to the image millions now associated with you. Joe handled that responsibility with composure, though the weight of it was beginning to build. For the moment, however, his star was shining brightly, and the rhythm of Bandstand carried him higher with each broadcast. Every regular on Bandstand had a moment when the right partner made them shine even brighter. And for Joe Fusco, that partner was Janet Hamill. Together, they became one of the floor's most admired duos. Joe's calm precision balanced Janet's lively charm, creating a harmony that caught the cameras again and again. To audiences at home, they seemed inseparable, a pair that embodied the innocent style and rhythm of teenage America in the late 1950s. Fan response was immediate. Letters addressed to Joe and Janet began arriving at the studio. Teen magazines occasionally featured their photos, and fan clubs debated which couples were the best on the show. At neighborhood dances, teenagers copied their steps, hoping to capture just a fraction of the chemistry they saw on TV. Even when Joe walked the streets of South Philadelphia, people would ask about Janet, as if the two of them existed only as a pair. Behind the cameras, however, the reality was less simple. Bandstand enforced strict rules. No gestures that could be interpreted as romantic, no movements that crossed the invisible line of what was deemed appropriate. Joe and Janet had to navigate these expectations carefully, projecting natural chemistry without breaking the show's clean-cut image. It was a delicate balance, being close enough to appear effortless, yet distant enough to keep the illusion intact. There were lighter moments, too. Stories circulated of Joe and Janet nearly slipping on the dance floor, only to recover with laughter that became part of the performance. Guest stars occasionally complimented their style, adding to their confidence. These small memories stitched together a portrait of two teenagers who, for a brief window in time, carried the hopes and attention of millions. But their visibility also came with pressure. Other dancers competed for airtime, eager for their own chance at the spotlight. Rumors swirled, fan clubs grew possessive, and rivalries simmered. Joe, however, remained steady, rarely letting gossip disturb his composure. In the end, what he and Janet created on screen was bigger than any rivalry. Their partnership became part of the mythology of Bandstand, a reminder of how two ordinary kids could become icons simply by moving together in perfect rhythm. The glow of television lights could make anyone appear untouchable, but life for Joe Fusco carried its share of complications. By the end of the 1950s, the routine of being a regular began to take its toll. Long afternoons at Studio B meant hours away from school and work, and the discipline required to remain a polished presence on screen was exhausting. The thrill of dancing in front of millions remained, but the weight of expectation grew heavier with each broadcast. Rumors began to swirl, as they often did among teenagers thrust into sudden fame. Some claimed Joe was quietly asked to step back from the show after being spotted in Rittenhouse Square, a Philadelphia neighborhood then associated with the city's gay community. In the conservative climate of the time, even the suggestion of such a connection could jeopardize a teenager standing on national television. Whether the story was true or only whispered, it reflects the precarious line Joe and many regulars walked. Their private lives were never fully their own. Joe himself later acknowledged another reality that few spoke about in the 1950s, the racial divide on Bandstand. While white teenagers like him received credit for popularizing dances, much of the style came directly from black teens who rarely appeared on screen. "Of course they did it better, but we got the credit," Joe admitted years later. "And when you think about it, that wasn't fair." His words revealed both honesty and awareness of the deeper inequalities hidden beneath the show's polished image. Eventually, the pressures became too much. Competition for camera time was fierce, and even the most admired regulars could not stay in the spotlight forever. Quietly, Joe stepped away, without a farewell episode or formal goodbye. For viewers at home, his absence was sudden. For Joe, it was a necessary release. The boy who had danced into millions of living rooms had chosen privacy over performance. Yet, stepping away from Bandstand was not the end of his connection to it. In truth, it marked the beginning of a different role, one less visible, but just as vital. The keeper of friendships, reunions, and memories that sustained the Bandstand family long after the music stopped. When Joe Fusco left the cameras behind, he didn't leave the world of people or of rhythm. He found a quieter path, one that allowed him to remain himself without the pressures of national television. Back in South Philadelphia, he worked as a hairdresser, a trade that suited his personality. The same steady hands that once guided him through dance steps now shaped styles for neighbors and friends. Clients remembered his warmth, his easy smile, and the way conversations with him felt like catching up with an old friend. More importantly, Joe became a cornerstone of the Bandstand community even after the show moved on. He hosted Tuesday night dinners, gatherings that reunited regulars in the comfort of his home. Those meals weren't about nostalgia alone. They were about keeping alive the sense of family forged under the studio lights. Joe was also the godfather of fellow dancer Betty Romantini's daughter, a gesture that reflected his loyalty to the friendships he held dear. His role expanded during the 1980s when bandstand nostalgia began to resurface. Working with Liz Braun of the Hotfoot Agency, Joe helped organize the Rock A Rama reunion in 1988. He made calls, tracked down dancers, and even assisted with choreography. Standing on stage at that reunion, he remarked, "Any place there's dancing, I'll still go." It was more than a sentimental line. It was his philosophy. Joe also found love and stability with his longtime partner, Ronald Green. In an era when personal lives were often hidden, Joe's partnership represented authenticity and quiet strength. Together, they built a life rooted in companionship, friendship, and trust. When Joe passed away in January 2009 at the age of 68, his funeral at Annunciation BVM Church in South Philadelphia was filled with family, friends, and fellow regulars. To them, he wasn't just a boy who once danced on television. He was the man who kept their community intact long after the spotlight faded. His life after Bandstand was proof that legacy isn't measured only by fame. It's measured by the love and connections we leave behind. Joe Fusco's name may not appear in bold headlines or dominate history books, yet his legacy endures in ways more meaningful than fleeting fame. To millions of viewers in the 1950s, he was the sharply dressed teen whose smooth steps and steady smile became part of their after-school routine. To those who knew him personally, he was the heart of the Bandstand family, the man who organized Tuesday dinners, who never let friendships fade, and who helped bring dancers back together decades later for reunions that rekindled the magic. His honesty about the show's hidden truths, from the racial inequities of credited dance styles to the pressures of image and identity, gave his story depth beyond the music. In many ways, Joe represented what Bandstand itself symbolized. Not only joy and youth, but the struggle of teenagers caught between private selves and public expectations. Though he passed away in 2009, Joe Fusco remains alive in memory, through the dances, the laughter, and the community he nurtured. Were you among those who remember seeing him glide across the screen? Or do you carry your own stories of Bandstand afternoons? Share them with us. We'd love to hear. And if these memories touched your heart, subscribe to American Bandstand Memories to keep the era alive.